It was news that shocked and rattled the world. 215 unmarked graves, many belonging to children, found near the site of a residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia. For anyone unfamiliar with the country's history of taking Indigenous children by force from their families to be assimilated in church-run institutions, the revelation was a horrific surprise. But for survivors, hearing that children were found buried there only confirmed things long known.
They would scoot us from the dormitory to the church. Don't mind the graves, and just walk by.
Bernard Jack has carried the trauma of his time at the Christie Roman Catholic Residential School on Vancouver Island for over 5 decades. He was a 6-year-old boy when he was first taken from his mom and dad.
We were basically dumped at the wharf where priests and nuns were waiting for us. The really bad bedwetters were tied to the top of the bunk and strapped, literally strapped. And you could just hear their screams to cover up the other screams.
Jack says 2021 has been a year of painful remembering, but validation too, because at last non-Indigenous Canadians and people around the world are finally confronting the truth. This year saw Canada mark the first ever National Day for Truth and Reconciliation on September 30th, a day to be observed annually so all Canadians can stop and reflect.
People had heard the information before, but I think seeing the physical evidence of it was very difficult for people to turn away from. And it allowed them to question more about what is going on today.
Because although Canada's last residential school closed in the 1990s, thousands of Indigenous kids are still being taken from their families. Only now, it's through the child welfare system instead.
Before, I think that there was really a white noise barrier between residential schools and the contemporary injustices. I think slowly, thanks to those discoveries, that's starting to be pierced through.
Earlier this year, a federal court upheld an order by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal that Ottawa pay compensation to First Nations children's families who have been harmed by the government's underfunding of child and family services on reserve. This month, the federal government announced $40 billion was being set aside to be spent not only compensating families, but fixing a broken system too. Negotiations on a deal with Indigenous child welfare advocates still continue, with a deadline of December 31st.
This is 30 years of the cost of failure, and that cost is high.
There will be more work to do to achieve reconciliation with the Canadian government, but there are also calls for greater truth and transparency from the Catholic churches who operated residential schools. Next year, an Indigenous delegation will head to the Vatican to meet with the head of the Catholic Church. Their planned visit was cancelled because of COVID this month. Pope Francis has agreed to come to Canada as well.
We have the opportunity to have the tone start at the top, meaning the Pope of the Church, to come to Canada and set the tone with an apology.
The Cowessess First Nation is working to identify more than 750 unmarked graves identified last summer near the Maryvale Residential School. Chief Cadmus Delorme says that saying sorry must only be the start of the church's work. Moving forward, the church needs to be a partner in reconciliation.
If it doesn't happen like that, I do see in 50 years, we're going to hand this off to the next generation to figure out.
It's like, for instance, if he was driving a bus full of 26 people, kids in there, and crash, all the kids die and he survives it. Oh, I'm sorry. That doesn't mean anything.
For Bernard Jack, the residential school system changed his life. It destroyed the lives of many around him and continues to impact his children and grandchildren's lives today. Generational trauma can extend hurt through families for decades. Jack says a papal apology alone is not justice in his mind. But every step towards the truth, that's at least a good place to begin. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.